Hello, I'm Dr. Jerad Harper from the U.S. Army War College's Department of Military Strategy, Planning, and Operations. And today I'm going to talk to you about the PRC's approach to warfighting and then apply this approach to scenarios by which the PRC might use this to seize Taiwan. Given the rising potential for great power conflict in the Indo-Pacific, this is an increasingly important topic. Although the PRC hasn't gone to full-scale war since 1979, they have a carefully crafted approach to warfighting and have devoted extensive thought to the employment of the military instrument of power. So let's start with examining under what circumstances the PRC envisions using military force. The answer to the previous question is to ensure or achieve PRC core interests in accordance with its military strategy of active defense. PRC core interests equate with the U.S. conceptualization of national interests. Although these sound completely rational, from an initial read, understanding the nuance of how China views sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national reunification present national interests that are quite at odds with the interests of the United States. The first, second, and fourth also all clearly relate to reunification with Taiwan. Their strategy of active defense makes this even more complex. The PRC concept of warfighting is subordinate to the national military strategy of active defense, which has been their official policy since 1949. However, the PRC's perspective on this has changed over time, depending on leadership and circumstances. It's important to understand the nuance in this ambiguous concept, which is very different from a Western view of defense. The PRC sees themselves as acting strategically defensive, while operationally and tactically offensive solutions are perfectly acceptable. This is consistent with the Chinese view of war as a form of negotiation. The key is that a political attack, affront, or perceived threat can be met with violence all the way up through the chain to full-scale offensive and preemptive war. The PRC is in its 9th year of a major military modernization effort unparalleled in its history. Beginning in 2015, the PRC has made great strides in 2 areas. First, a number of structural, doctrinal, and capability development initiatives reshaping the PLA and its ability to execute joint operations. And second, ensuring absolute loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party and personally to Xi Jinping. The PLA's ability to achieve its core interests, should the use of force be deemed necessary, have significantly improved and are expected to continue trending in that direction as they move through their modernization gates for 2027, which are closely focused on developing military capabilities that would allow them to take Taiwan, through 2035, which is focused on having the ability to project power and counter the U.S. throughout the Indo-Pacific, and by 2049, having the capability to project power around the world, being either an equal with U.S. or the military hegemon. It's important to note that the 2027 goal is a newer goal that was added in after the PLA had achieved its 2020 goal. Originally, there were only 2020, 2035, and 2049. In my experience, you only move up such a timeline because of 2 reasons. 1, because you feel that you're ahead of schedule, and or 2, because there's an important reason why you need to get something done earlier. 3 key concepts in PLA modernization are mechanization, informatization, and intelligentization. Essentially, the way I like to think about it is that mechanization correlates with the ability to achieve combined arms. Informatization is the ability to execute network-enabled warfare. Intelligentization is the ability to benefit from human-machine teaming, particularly through the use of AI-enabled systems, to speed decision-making and improve the speed, accuracy, and autonomy of targeting. The PLA approach to warfighting has been heavily influenced by their observations regarding the conduct and outcomes of the U.S. campaigns against Iraq in 1991 and 2003. The dramatic U.S. success in Desert Storm was a shock to the PLA. In particular, they are impressed by the U.S. ability to apply precision fires, rapidly maneuver, and integrate joint forces, supported by a powerful information campaign that gained and maintained international support. This led to over a decade of deep discussion within the PLA, which was further reinforced by U.S. performance in 2003. Again, the lessons learned: joint operations, precision application of firepower, controlling the narrative. Each of these parts are critical. They've taken this and made it their own. Some may call what has emerged as something that in some ways could be called joint or multi-domain operations with Chinese characteristics. This is probably true in some ways, but there are important differences. Let's see how this lens might or might not be applicable as we press on. Where does the PLA come down? A balance of art and science in warfare, or something else? Both the PLA and the PRC in general take a systems engineering approach to warfare. Every problem can be solved if you follow the correct approach and throw enough resources and effort at it. There is a concrete solution for everything. This makes sense in a Leninist political system that inherently doesn't trust its people. They're very heavy on the science in warfighting. Why does this matter to their approach to warfighting? The PLA acknowledges the need for art, particularly the need for initiative and execution at the small unit level, but they don't really practice it. This is obviously different from the Western approach, and most of you can probably think of how this ignores issues such as friction, which is interesting because PLA leaders read Clausewitz just as we do. But this is their solution for their system, and they've really thought this through. It has key problems, but it also has some key strengths. So now we get to the PRC approach to warfighting. This is where we get to their system of systems approach. They conceptualize war as a confrontation of opposing systems. The key to victory is to defeat or destroy your opponent's system. To achieve this, you don't have to destroy all of their capabilities. Instead, you need to destroy or neutralize the key components that allow their system to function. So the key to victory is to first identify crucial vulnerabilities in the enemy's system, then attack those vulnerabilities with speed, precision, and intensity, either through kinetic or non-kinetic means. The goal of systems destruction warfare is to paralyze the enemy's operational system by impacting its key functions. So how does the PRC plan to prevail in a systems versus systems confrontation? By achieving, first, information dominance, part of their 3 superiorities or 3 dominances, which we'll discuss later. Second, precision strikes. And third, effectively executing joint warfare. The key is to execute all 3 of these in a tightly integrated fashion and with speed and intensity. To achieve systems destruction, the PLA is focused on what they call target-centric operations. The goal of PLA targeting is to degrade enemy decision-making to enable operational advantage. Their goal is to blind the enemy by degrading, denying, or disabling capabilities that provide the adversary with timely and accurate information. So what are the key targets in this approach? Leadership, C2 nodes, sensors, and information hubs. Similarly, nodes for enemy logistics systems are key targets, particularly for the US. These can be neutralized by either, or in some cases both, kinetic or non-kinetic means. Systems destruction undergirds the current PLA operational concept of integrated joint operations, as well as their desired goal of achieving a new operating concept labeled multi-domain precision warfare. This objective future concept is generally similar to integrated joint operations, except faster and more precise. It would leverage an integrated C4ISR network supported by artificial intelligence and big data processing abilities, part of the PLA's goal of intelligentized warfare. One key difference between the way that the US and PRC conceptually approach warfighting is the PRC focus on the centrality of the cognitive domain of warfighting. This focuses on enemy decision-making as well as both government and popular will. You can see this in our previous discussion about seeking paralysis and their adversary. This is reflected in the way that they conceptualize systems destruction and in some of the unique gray zone tools and approaches developed to achieve their goals. The PRC concept of the 3 warfares is intertwined with a view of war that is much more fluid from the general view of war versus not war in the West. These 3 intertwined and mutually supporting information approaches begin in what we in the West would call the gray zone and continue on into large-scale combat operations. The 3 warfares are conducted by the Strategic Support Force, as well as the political warfare departments of the Central Military Commission and the theater commands, as well as at least theoretically in tandem with other elements of the PRC government. One of the unique organizational structures emerging from the PLA's modernization reforms was the creation of the Strategic Support Force, an integrated organization specifically organized to support systems destruction warfare. There was no U.S. parallel to this organization, combining their space, cyber, and electronic warfare and psychological warfare elements into one organization. One potential drawback was that the SSF reported directly to the CMC and only coordinated with theater commands in exercises and contingencies.
At least partially in response to this drawback, in April 2024, the PLA restructured the Strategic Support Force into three separate elements. The Aerospace Force, responsible for the space domain. The Cyberspace Force, responsible for cyber and electronic warfare. And the Information Support Force, responsible for information and network support. Together, these elements provide the PLA with a focused set of tools integrated into the PLA's operational command structure and purposely designed both to support systems destruction warfare against an opponent and simultaneously defend their own space, cyber, and information systems against potential attack. We'll talk about how these new organizations are now integrated into the PLA's theater commands and Joint C2 system a little bit later.
The PRC also has specialized gray zone capabilities working under PLA control. These mass fishing boats of the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia, usually just called the Maritime Militia, are frequently seen in disputed waters directly supported by the Chinese Coast Guard and always with the PLA Navy just on the horizon. The Maritime Militia reports to the theater commands through the People's Armed Police structure, while the Chinese Coast Guard regularly function under PLA Navy Theater Commander Tactical Control. In more high-tempo operations, their ability to harass and interdict would also be useful in maritime interdiction efforts. It's also important to note that the Maritime Militia also includes forces that could marshal the PRC's large number of civilian ferries and roll-on, roll-off shipping, all constructed to PLA Navy specifications based on PRC national security law in support of PLA operations in the event of an invasion of Taiwan. These are regularly exercised to move military forces, launch amphibious operations, and even to use as offshore artillery platforms for the PLA Army. Moving higher up the scale of intensity, the PLA emphasizes trying to achieve its goals through what it calls non-contact warfare, the massed and concentrated employment of joint precision fires delivered by the rocket forces, Air Force, Navy, and Army to kinetically engage critical targets of the enemy. These would be supported by space combat systems both to aid PLA targeting and to disrupt enemy defensive efforts and C2. The PRC recognizes that their ability to employ joint capabilities on the ground may be messy and potentially problematic. So their intent is to either achieve their goals by joint firepower strikes or to heavily disrupt the enemy and make the job significantly easier if and when ground forces are employed. We've already talked about the PLA focus on information dominance, but the ultimate focus of PLA operations is what is alternately translated as either the three superiorities or the three dominances. Joint effects are achieved through achieving dominance in the information, air, and naval domains. This last is more simply understood as sea control. Achieving these may accomplish PRC goals on their own, and all are necessary precursors to the commitment of ground forces. A key element in the PRC's approach to warfighting is its concept of counter-intervention, in particular with warfighting scenarios involving Taiwan. But you could also apply this to potential conflicts with the Philippines or Vietnam. The PRC is not really concerned with being able to overcome the threat from these militaries. Instead, the threat that it is concerned with is the threat of intervention in these conflicts by the U.S. and its major allies. Consequently, planning for counter-intervention, ways to counter the ability of the U.S. and its allies to prevent the PRC from accomplishing its military objectives, is a major part of every war plan and operation. This is interrelated with the PRC belief that they can control escalation through careful management of the problem, quick action, and thorough analysis of the situation in advance. Think of this as the outside ring to support ongoing inside ring operations. Whether this is simply a blocking force in place or supported by non-kinetic or kinetic operations would depend on PRC risk calculus. It's important to understand that the PRC in general appears to be more tolerant of risk than a Western audience. Part of this is probably because they haven't come out of 2 decades of combat operations. It's also important to understand that the PLA assumes that any potential conflict with Taiwan would involve the US and likely the Japanese. If you have a warfighting approach focused on rapid, concentrated strikes to cause paralysis of your enemy, and you assume that the enemy will also be in the fight, how would you act right from the start? In 2022, CSIS designed a wargame of a PRC amphibious invasion of Taiwan and ran it 24 times with a group of US-China experts. One of the outcomes of these war games was the devastating nature of Chinese first strike attacks by missiles against airfields in Japan, which impacted the Allied ability to defend Taiwan. Whether the PRC would start off with such an aggressive stance is unknown, but it would be consistent with their goal of paralyzing adversaries from the outset. For the near term, the PLA focuses on what they call near-seas operations, in other words, in close proximity to the PRC. They view their operating environment as hemmed in by a first and second island chain, dominated by the U.S. and a series of treaty allies and partners. This gives the U.S. control of PRC sea lines of communication and constrains its potential freedom of movement. These island chains also provide the U.S. with a range of potential basing options and strategic depth to use in a potential conflict. To counter this, the PRC has developed an interwoven ring to counter U.S. ability to operate inside the first and second island chain. We call this an anti-access area denial, or A2AD strategy. The PLA's A2AD approach benefits from a web of long-range fires and air defenses designed to make it increasingly more difficult for adversaries to operate and push them further and further away from potential PRC objectives, such as Taiwan or the 9-dash line. The close-in ring of A2AD consists of long-range cruise missiles to target both land and naval targets, and an integrated air defense system to protect them. Further out, DF-21 medium-range ballistic missiles threaten the ability of U.S. carrier strike groups to effect operations against Taiwan. Further out past Guam, the PRC's new hypersonic intermediate-range ballistic missiles and cruise missile-armed long-range bombers could strike U.S. assets further out past the second island chain. So now we move on to the important concept of command and control. The PLA's highly centralized command and control system almost certainly makes it easier for them to go to war, but also likely constitutes a weak spot for large-scale combat operations, particularly the longer they go on. The decision on whether to employ the PLA will ultimately come down to one man. Xi Jinping is CCP chairman and chairman of the Central Military Commission, which we'll explore in a second. He is 70 years old. Xi has centralized power on a scale not seen since Deng or Mao, and after a series of leadership purges, it is unlikely that anyone would challenge his inclination to use force. What will his legacy be? Chairman Xi and the Central Military Commission would directly oversee any potential combat operations through the CMC's Joint Operations Command Center. Operational control of PLA joint forces is executed by their 5 theater commands, another product of their 2015 military reforms. The PLA services are OPCON to the theater commands, with the exception of the PLA Rocket Force's nuclear missile forces.
Here you can see greater details on the PLA joint structure. Note that each service has its own ground forces. The PLA Navy has the PLA Navy Marine Corps, and the PLA Air Force has the Airborne Corps. The Rocket Force contains all of the PLA's land-based conventional missiles, ballistic, cruise, and hypersonics, as well as its nuclear missiles, although the latter are directly under CMC control. The PLA services train and equip their forces, but the 5 theater commands exercise operational control over them. At the top left, although reporting directly to the CMC, the 4 supporting forces, the Cyberspace Force, Aerospace Force, Information Support Force, and Joint Logistics Support Force, all maintain forces in each of the theater commands that are permanently under the tactical control of each theater command's Joint Operations Command Center. The PLA theater commands, Joint Operations Command Centers, would execute any warfighting scenarios under the direction of the CMC JOC. Although they're often compared with U.S. combatant commands, in many ways, the theater commands are similar to what in the American system would be standing joint task forces. The PLA doesn't presently visualize subordinate JTF structures underneath them. Each theater command has subordinate service headquarters contained in its Joint Operations Command Centers. In wartime, the theater JOC would be responsible for command and control and integrating joint operations. Day-to-day activities of the services fall under the control of the service headquarters in each theater command. But for joint operations in wartime, each of the service headquarters elements runs what are termed as sub-center headquarters to control the land, maritime, air and air defense, and conventional missile components in their respective areas of operations. For example, the Land Ops Subcenter would command and control not just PLA Army forces, but also airborne and Marine forces that have landed and are on the ground. And the Conventional Missile Ops Subcenter controls not only PLA rocket force elements, but also the PLA Army's new long-range rocket artillery. In the event of a major contingency, such as Taiwan, the other theater commands would move forces to the control of another, in this case, the Eastern Theater Command, which has been designated as what the PLA calls the main strategic direction. These other theater commands would then control the operations of the remaining forces in their normal areas of responsibility. In the event of a major conflict, again, let's use the Taiwan example, that evolves into fighting in the South China Sea all the way up through the East China Sea and Sea of Japan. This overall system would likely experience significant stress. It would be hard for the Central Military Commission to simultaneously micromanage actions in all of these theaters, and battle handoff between theater commands could present major challenges. Carefully scripting operations could likely help integrate these cross-theater command operations initially, but over time, this scripting would rapidly become inadequate to meet evolving demands. One of the driving factors in Xi Jinping's modernization efforts has been a concern among senior Chinese military and government officials, expressed only in Chinese language military and party media sources, with the combat readiness of the PLA. These concerns continue to pop up again and again, although their exact terminology sometimes changes. The more recent version of this has been a concern with the ability of PLA officers to execute those leadership tasks that most worldwide military experts would consider the basics of combat leadership. The ability to judge situations, understand higher commanders' intent, make rapid operational decisions, deploy troops, and deal with unexpected situations. Today, these are a focus of ongoing PLA exercises. And additionally, sites such as the PLA Army's Jerad Combat Training Center in Inner Mongolia, their equivalent of America's National Training Center at Fort Irwin, California, seek to improve these capabilities.
Although the PLA is clearly working on it, they are simultaneously being pushed to ensure loyalty to the party through mandatory party training, which consumes as much as 30% of a unit's training schedule. Any Western military officer will know how much work it is to train combat readiness even without these sorts of time distractors. Now compound this even further with the PLA's enlisted force. The PLA only created a non-commissioned officer corps in 1999. Their junior enlisted, comprising a little over 1/3 of the overall force, are conscripts serving 2-year terms. The high turnover rate of personnel likely makes it difficult to create a high degree of combat readiness. Nevertheless, we won't know how good they are until they're actually tested operationally. Interestingly, just across the strait, Taiwan also has conscription, with approximately 20% of their force composed of conscripts, who just recently had their time of enlistment increased from 4 months to 1 year. This gets to the command and control conundrum for the PLA. Although PLA writing emphasizes the need for initiative, particularly at the lower levels, in reality, micromanagement from above is a central element of the practices and command and control systems of the PLA. So just how joint is the PLA joint force? There's a clear direction to achieve this, driven by Xi, and simultaneously an acknowledged imperative for jointness. But overall, the reality today appears to be that a better way to describe their operations is intra-service rather than actual jointness. Jointness, as they see it, is often divided by time, phase, and location. Joint force training has been a goal for the PLA since 2001, a response to the U.S. military. Theater-level training has increased significantly since established post-2015 reforms. But service-level joint training is more limited. In general, the Navy and Air Force are more focused on this, while the Army has been more hesitant in this direction. Notably, unlike the U.S., the PLA Air Force doesn't do close air support, although they definitely do strike missions. Instead, the PLA Army plans and trains to support themselves through artillery, long-range rockets, attack helicopters, and drones. However, having said all this about jointness, this all depends on where you are. The Eastern Theater Command and Southern Theater Command are more used to inter-service than others. An important point to note is that recent Taiwan exercises and crisis operations, like the Pelosi visit, are providing continuous real-world opportunities to practice jointness. In the Eastern Theater Command, joint operations, supported by joint surveillance, are executed around Taiwan on a monthly and frequently near weekly or even daily basis. The PLA can do a number of things from a warfighting standpoint, but in many ways, PLA capabilities are meant first and foremost to provide the military means for the PRC to seize Taiwan should the order be given by Xi Jinping or a successor. So now we'll examine Taiwan and explore the three broad campaigns that the PLA could use to seize Taiwan. The following descriptions aren't meant to be exacting and detailed war plans. There are numerous classified and unclassified studies that can do this better. Instead, this is meant to help you visualize PLA warfighting and how PLA capabilities can be employed in different types of campaigns. So let's start with Taiwan. Taiwan is an island approximately 235 miles long and 81 miles wide at its widest point. It has a population of almost 24 million people who are heavily clustered in a number of urban centers along the heavily populated west coast. A heavily forested mountain range runs down the center of the island, leaving a narrow coastal strip along parts of the east coast, which are accessible only by a few highway tunnels and narrow roads. A number of rivers wind their way from the mountains to the coast, requiring numerous bridges and creating canalizing features for rapid north-south movement or east-west movement in Taiwan's far north. More than 8 million people, 1/3 of Taiwan's population, live in the urban cluster of Taipei and New Taipei City in the north, with another 400,000 just to the west in Taiyuan, home of Taiwan's largest international airport, and another 400,000 to the northeast in the port of Keelung. South of Taiyuan, the headquarters and science park of global semiconductor giant TSMC are located in Hsinchu, a city of 400,000. In southwest Taiwan, the city of Kaohsiung, a city of 1.5 million people, is Taiwan's largest port and the 13th largest port in the world. Taiwan also has 3 other international airports and several other ports. These are all key infrastructure which would be necessary objectives in any PLA island landing campaign. Potential invasion beaches are anywhere from 90 miles off the coast of China in the north to 185 miles in the south. Taiwan is extremely close to Japan's Ryukyu Islands, with the southwestern tip, Yonaguni Island, only 65 miles to the east of Taiwan. This proximity and Japan's increasing concern with PRC aggression has driven Japan's recent defense realignment and its likely commitment to any further conflict in and around Taiwan. Taipei is 400 miles away from Okinawa and the large American and Japanese presence there, although US and Japanese forces have increasingly been exercising further south into the Ryukyus. It is 1,710 miles to Guam, the westernmost part of the United States, and major presence for American joint military power. And given the increasingly close U.S. defense relationship to the Philippines, Kaohsiung in southern Taiwan is only 250 to 400 miles away from the Edka sites in North Luzon, and 557 miles away from Manila. One important thing about any potential Taiwan conflict is understanding that Taiwan includes 3 groups of coastal islands right off the coast of the PRC, and another just to Taiwan's west. The Genmen Islands, I know it's a K, but that's how it's pronounced, are a group of several small islands less than 4 miles off the coast of the PRC and right next to 2 Chinese cities. The Wuchio Islands, 2 small islands 16 miles off the coast of Taiwan and 90 miles west of Taichung, Taiwan. The Matsu Islands, 36 islands and islets to the northeast, approximately 12 miles from the PRC at their furthest. And finally, there are the Pinggu Islands, another group of 90 islands and islets with a larger main island, 30 miles off the coast of Taiwan and 90 miles off the coast of China. All of these have Taiwanese garrisons occupying extensive underground defenses. They've endured Chinese shelling going all the way back to the 1950s. One of the most discussed options for a PRC effort to seize Taiwan is an amphibious invasion, which we'll cover in a few minutes. An amphibious invasion of Taiwan would require attackers to rapidly gain access to a port and an airfield after getting ashore and securing a lodgment. But Taiwan's geography makes such an invasion extremely difficult. High cliffs and the narrow coastline largely rule out the east coast, and there are only a small number of beaches suitable for landing on the north and west coasts. All of these are well known, aiding Taiwanese defenders. Working in order of the most to least advantageous for the PRC, these beaches are located in the north around Taipei, in Kaohsiung and just to its south, and in the center around Taichung and Tainan. Finally, the PRC could try to land at Yilan, east of Taipei and across the mountains, but these landing sites would be far less desirable. Further complicating the situation is the increased American training presence that has been recently acknowledged on Taiwan and its surrounding islands, including Jinmen. The first type of approach that we'll examine is a joint firepower strike campaign. This option could be initiated either on its own, as a follow-on to a blockade, or the precursor to an invasion. The goal of this type of operation would be to break the will of the Taiwanese people and government. As with any of the military options that we'll be discussing today, a joint firepower strike campaign would be crossing the Rubicon for the PRC government. There would be no going back. Initiating an explosion of violence in the Taiwan Straits of this magnitude would expend enormous political capital for the PRC government. Additionally, for an authoritarian system like the PRC, the accompanying popular upswell of nationalist fervor, likely carefully managed and fanned by the PRC government, but also a natural result of this sort of endeavor, is not something that could result in failure. Failure to be successful would be a massive blow to the CCP's internal image and its control of their population. Firepower strike campaigns have often been used by the US, NATO, and Russia in recent decades with a great deal of media attention, but seldom purely on their own. Therefore, the PRC is unlikely to attempt a firepower-only campaign that is not a precursor to an invasion unless it has confidence of severe weaknesses or fractures within Taiwan's domestic political scene that cause PRC leaders to believe that such a hammered blow would be enough to gain rapid victory without causing US-led intervention. A joint firepower strike campaign would likely consist of waves of non-kinetic and kinetic attacks. It would likely be led off by the Strategic Support Force and then followed by the Rocket Force and other elements of the PLA. First, electronic warfare assets would jam Taiwanese C4ISR systems. Cyber attacks would target military and government sites. A wave of mis- and disinformation would be targeted at social media. Next, kinetic attacks would begin, certainly from the Rocket Force, but likely from all elements of the PLA, to shock and paralyze the Taiwanese government and people, breaking their will. Rocket fires from PLA Army artillery units would target air defense capabilities. Ballistic and cruise missile strikes would then kinetically target C4ISR sites along with air bases and logistical infrastructure. These might not be purely military targets either. Culturally relevant sites such as Taipei's signature Taipei 101 skyscraper and the presidential office complex might be hit for the psychological impact caused by their destruction. Finally, strike aircraft and drones would continue the attacks. Such a campaign could go with waves of varying intensity for several weeks before achieving success or causing the PLA to move on to other options. The outlying islands might be targeted by PLA Army artillery as the campaign continues. Given the intent to carefully wield the scalpel of precision strikes without impacting other countries other than by their sheer economic impact of these operations, the PRC might not seek to target space-based assets with jamming until the US either showed a proclivity for action or if PRC leadership felt that such an attack would be a truly decisive blow. The next military option we'll explore is a blockade, or more correctly in naval terminology, maritime interdiction operations. As discussed previously, this kind of operation would be a massive expenditure of political capital, and if PRC leaders don't assess it to be working, they would almost certainly press on to an invasion due to sunk domestic and foreign policy costs. We have likely seen the general outline of the PRC blockade plan in the fourth Taiwan Straits crisis that occurred during and subsequent to the visit of U.S. Speaker of the House Pelosi to Taiwan in August 2022. PLA Navy forces occupied and/or conducted live fire operations in the pink areas of the map, moved right up to the 12 nautical mile exclusion zone, and we have subsequently now seen regular PLA carrier operations to the east of Taiwan, which were not seen before. This was clearly a deterrent show of force effort, but also almost certainly a live test of components of their blockade plan. A PRC blockade would likely start like this. Although maritime interdiction efforts are universally recognized as an act of war, the PRC would start off with information operations, with the announcement of a more innocuous term like maritime quarantine for safety and security reasons, while its surface combatants and submarines occupy blocking positions around Taiwan. Carrier strike groups would occupy positions to the north, south, and east of the island, and PLA Air Force patrols would cover and support PLA Navy operations. Further surface and submarine forces would then set up a counter-interdiction screen further out to prevent U.S. and/or Allied interference. The PRC would warn against foreign intervention, and PLA rocket forces would be on high alert to conduct strikes against either Taiwanese or outside forces attempting to break the blockade. To lessen the aggressive nature of interdiction and search and seizure efforts, the Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia would likely be in the lead, supported by armed PLA Navy drones. Electronic warfare would be used to disrupt Taiwanese military assets, and these operations likely would be supported by Strategic Support Force cyber operations against Taiwan and any potential intervening forces. The final option that we'll examine is an amphibious invasion of Taiwan, otherwise termed as a joint island landing campaign. Amphibious operations of this magnitude are extremely complex operations requiring careful coordination and integration of an enormous number of military capabilities. The PLA is clearly cognizant of these challenges, but has been planning and preparing for such an operation for more than 70 years. The weather in the Taiwan Straits would also be a significant challenge. Because the shallow waters are heavily impacted by seasonal storms, creating strong winds, choppy seas, and fog, most experts believe that weather that would generally favor an invasion is only present in either late September and October in the fall or March through April in the spring. At present, the PLA Navy lacks the capability to amphibiously land more than 2 to 3 brigades of ground forces, most of them amphibious mechanized infantry, accompanied by an equivalent-sized force of airborne and air assault infantry at any one time. This is far less than the 6 Allied infantry and 2 airborne divisions that landed at Normandy in 1944. Therefore, any landing that would be conducted would need to be focused on a narrower front. Since Taiwan's available landing sites are smaller than those at Normandy, this would likely be the case anyways. Barring heavy casualties to the assault ships and air transports themselves, it would take about a day or two to go back to ports and airfields in mainland China, pick up new forces, and return for subsequent landings. This is not to say, however, that the PLA, benefiting from the PRC's massive shipbuilding capability, could invest further resources in landing craft in the future and gain the ability to lift a much larger force at one time. An immense amount of ground forces would be available for follow-on operations, and the full weight of the PLA would be in support of the initial clearing operations, the landings themselves, and subsequent follow-on operations. The Taiwanese military has similarly been preparing for such an invasion for 70 years, and with increasing intensity in recent years. Taiwanese exercises rehearse stopping PLA invaders before or as they hit the small number of beaches and using the tight terrain to their advantage. They would likely attempt to mine and otherwise block their harbors and attempt to disperse their command and control to shield against PLA attack. For our purposes today, which is simply to explore the application of PLA warfighting doctrine and capabilities in a reasonably realistic scenario, we will look at an invasion of beaches in northern Taiwan. Although these landings would be against heavy defensive forces that would require extensive fire support to disrupt, successful landing in these locations put the landing force close to required ports and airfields to secure a lodgment and allow follow-on forces. Subsequent to the establishment of a secure lodgment, they placed these forces in extremely close proximity to Taipei, the national capital and psychological center of Taiwan. Seizing Taipei would be a massive blow to Taiwanese will and might be enough to secure Taiwanese surrender. Given the potential casualties at risk, it's also possible that simply the proximity of a secure PLA lodgment might be enough to secure a Taiwanese collapse, although the PLA wouldn't be counting on this. The opening phases of an invasion would likely parallel many of those in a joint firepower strike, and as discussed earlier, the PLA will almost certainly hope to gain victory by breaking Taiwanese will in these early phases alone. To prepare for future operations, it would first be necessary to clear obstacles for subsequent amphibious operations. The campaign would likely open with firepower strikes from the PLA Army and some elements of the rocket force to suppress and destroy Taiwanese forces on the outer islands. The PLA would then attempt to gain and maintain information, air, and sea dominance. Information operations would call for the Taiwan government to surrender and unify with the PRC. Subsequent I.O. would attempt to sow myths and disinformation while simultaneously seeking to shut down all communications on and to Taiwan through cyber attacks and jamming of space assets. Electronic warfare would seek to take down Taiwanese political and military command and control systems. PLA Army long-range rocket artillery would seek to destroy air defense and anti-ship cruise missile capabilities. Rocket Force and PLA Navy anti-ship missiles would strike the Taiwanese Navy alongside surface attacks against command and control sites and airfields. The PLA Air Force would then seek to clear the skies and destroy Taiwanese military airfields. When Taiwanese anti-ship and anti-aircraft capabilities were assessed as destroyed, the PLA Amphibious Landing Force would then begin to assemble north of Taiwan. PLA Navy assault ships, both Type 71 craft and their new Type 75 landing craft, which carry their own attack helicopters and strike drones along with landing forces, would then assemble off the shores of Taiwan. PLA exercises have practiced launching amphibious mechanized forces off of civilian ferries, and these could significantly expand the number of forces that they could land. No matter how effective the earlier clearing operations were, some air defense and aircraft would likely remain, and Taiwan might even be able to have hidden some anti-ship missiles. These will be the target of preparatory fires. Heavy PLA jamming of space and cyber attacks and electronic warfare to disrupt C2 will continue. PLA Army long-range rockets will target air defense and the landing sites. Special forces will insert to assist with landings, conduct direct action against airfields and headquarters, and assist targeting of supporting fires. The PLA Air Force will strike remaining artillery and airfields. Airborne and air assault forces will land to support follow-on movement. Attack helicopters and drones, potentially supported by artillery firing from offshore civilian ferries, will provide direct support to the landings. Finally, amphibious forces will swim ashore to seize the landing zones. The PLA will likely have to fight intensely to successfully secure landing zones, and as long as their assault craft survive, they will keep coming back with more amphibious forces as necessary to get ashore. As soon as they can secure a port, roll-on, roll-off vessels will bring in follow-on armor, mechanized, and artillery to support follow-on attacks to seize Taipei. Additional air assault forces and air landing forces, once an airfield is secured, will further enable the massing of forces and further offensive operations. But the landings themselves will almost certainly not be the most critical aspect of amphibious operations to seize Taiwan. The most difficult task for the PLA will be counter-intervention operations. As discussed earlier, the PLA Navy and Air Force, supported by the Rocket Force, will set up an outer ring to block U.S. and Allied intervention. They will be focused on U.S. and Allied bases in the Western Pacific, but also on the mass of U.S. forces available in Hawaii and the West Coast. If current trends continue and the U.S. can secure access to basing in the Philippines, this will become even more challenging. The dilemma for PRC forces will be this: should they simply block U.S. and Allied forces, support this with non-kinetic options, or use the full weight of kinetic options for a first strike? The PRC is very likely to support their counter-intervention operations with a range of non-kinetic options and seek paralysis and disruption. This could include jamming of satellites, cyber attacks against ports all the way to the U.S., Japanese, and Australian homelands, and electronic warfare against military assets in the region, all supported by information operations and the deterrent value of the PLA Rocket Force. Or the PRC may calculate that U.S. and Allied support is near certain anyway, and, alongside the non-kinetic options that we just discussed, they may choose to take advantage of first strike kinetic operations against U.S. and Allied military targets across the Western Pacific, possibly including not only satellite jamming, but satellite destruction. Such attacks would seek to paralyze the U.S. and Japanese and gain time to create a fait accompli by seizing Taiwan before the U.S. and allies can respond. Thanks for your attention. The goal of this video was for you to get a better understanding of the PRC and their approach to warfighting. Conflict between the U.S. and PRC is definitely not inevitable and would be devastating for both sides in the entire world. Nevertheless, this has not prevented great power conflict in the past. Regardless, as the pacing threat for the U.S. Department of Defense, it's vitally important that we understand the PRC's approach to warfighting and how this might be applied to Taiwan. And, hopefully, this has inspired you for further study. Thank you.